Welcome, everyone, to our second session of the Young Writers Can Change the World Virtual Summit. Thank you for your patience as we had a little technical difficulties getting Mr. Bond on the video. Thank you all for your patience. We're about to dive in. Now, as you know, my name is Brett Harris. I'm your host for this summit, and our mission and our purpose is to give young writers the same kind of support, community training that exists for other serious hobbies and career paths. And all of the speakers that are coming here today and tomorrow, starting with our first session and now with Douglas Bond, these are speakers who have had incredible careers as writers and authors and who believe in young writers enough to take time out of their schedules to come and teach you, and to teach you serious level things, not just kid level things, but serious level training. And I'm so excited for you to learn from Douglas Bond. Well, sorry, I just had something starting to play. The live stream started to play in another tab on my computer. That was very confusing. I heard my own voice. All right, so I'm so excited for you to learn from Douglas Bond because he is the award-winning author of more than 35 books. Our first speaker had 20 books. Douglas Bond has 35 books. He's also the father of 6, the grandfather of 10, with a new granddaughter being born recently. He is the director for the Oxford Creative Writing Masterclass, which how cool does that sound? He's a 2-time Grace Award book finalist. He's an editor for writers and for publishers. He's the author of New Reformation Hymns, a frequent speaker at conferences and churches, including ministry in the UK, the continent, Australia, Uganda, the Kingdom of Tonga, Peru, and he's an award-winning teacher and leader of church history tours in Europe. So, guys, you're going to learn so much from this. The topic for this session is 7 things that C.S. Lewis has taught Douglas Bond about writing. So I'm going to welcome Douglas Bond to the stage. Thank you so much for being here. So
My
excited
for
everyone to learn from you.
My pleasure.
I'm excited to learn from you. I'm going to be listening along with everyone.
Lots of folks to learn from. Good folks here. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight. Brett, thanks for that introduction. C.S. Lewis taught me nothing about technology, and I consider myself the quint ultimate technomoron. But thankfully, that's fairly disconnected from writing. So anyway, it's great to be with you today. Lewis has taught me so many things. I don't write to sound like C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or Shakespeare or Dickens or Charlotte Bronte or Jane Austen. I'm naming some of my favorites. I don't write trying to be like them. And I think that's my opening and sort of overarching thing here. We've got C.S. Lewis on the table. We're going to look at 7 things he's taught us. And the things he's taught us are ways for you, the young writer, to find your voice. We've already got Dickens. We've already got Shakespeare. We've already got Bret Harris. We've already got these other writers. S.D. Smith, we've got them. We don't need somebody else to come along and try to write like them. But what we do need is for each of you to be equipped with all the richness of the rules of writing, which, by the way, didn't come from down and imposed on us. They've grown organically out of what works in storytelling, in communicating. And so these are very important things. Lewis never wrote a book on writing. There's a Stephen King book out there on writing, and there's a lot of good things to learn from that. I've read a lot of and reread a lot of books on writing, Elements of Style. I've read over and over again. I used to teach it. And my copy is literally falling apart. I mean, the pages come out. I have to make sure I stuff them back in the right place and everything. Those are all valuable and important books. Lewis, I think 2 reasons why Lewis did not write for us a book on writing. Number 1, I think Lewis was too humble for that. He didn't really see himself as a great writer. He was sort of shocked that he was getting all this acclaim. He's genuinely, as a Christian, a follower of Christ, he's genuinely genuinely a humble man. So he didn't think that he could set himself up as the expert to tell you how to write. So you might be thinking, where'd you get the 7 things then? Well, I'm going to tell you that in a second here. But the other thing is, I think that Lewis was too busy doing the writing itself to pause and write about it. I love what Flannery O'Connor says when she was first invited to come and lecture at the University of Iowa on writing. She was sort of dismissive of that, and she said, "Well, asking me to come, lecture on writing is like asking a fish to come lecture on swimming." In other words, it's something that grew so organically that he wasn't even thinking about it. You're at the stage, and frankly, I consider myself at the stage where I need to go back and rehearse these critical things. These 7 things that I'm going to share with you in the next little bit here are things that I've discovered in Lewis's letters, primarily in his letters. There's a few other places to mention where these emerge, but it's primarily in letters. He had lots of fans. And back in those days, they didn't come as emails. They didn't come as comments on social media streams, things like that. He had fans that wrote him physical letters, and he had to read those letters. And it was his goal, because he loved people. He loved his neighbor as himself. He wanted to do that. And if a neighbor wrote him a letter, and an enthusiastic reader, he wanted to reply to that. We'll talk about how he managed to do that when he had thousands and thousands and thousands of letters to reply to. But it's in those letters that we learn things about C.S. Lewis. Lewis believed that the writing process itself inherently is valuable for everybody. Whether you're published and whether you've got books out there that are in print and that are being translated into other languages, or that are in audiobook and all of those things, whether that happens or not, and it's marvelous if it does, but whether that happens or not, there's an inherent value in you writing. He put it this way. He said, "Whenever you are fed up with life, start writing. Ink is the great cure for all human ills." Now, he's using hyperbole there. He knows that ultimately Jesus, in the grace of the gospel, is the great cure for all human ills. But he knows in this level, talking about writing, that there's something inherent about the writing process. You put things down on paper, you have them there now, hard words to assess, don't you? When they're floating around in your mind and your imagination, and you're thinking about them, or you're awake at night and you're thinking about them, or you're just daydreaming and you're thinking, they're not there to assess. You can't pause and say, wait a minute, how am I thinking? How is this accurate thinking? Is this thinking going in a good direction? Is this thinking going to take me to the edge of a cliff? Is this thinking going to take me to temptation, lead me to We can assess our thinking when we write it down. We'll talk about some of the critical moments when that is so critical. But let's launch in. Do I have slides? I don't need slides. You got a pen and pencil, right? You got your laptop, your keys going there. Let's talk about number 1. Lewis taught me about writing. I really kind of should amend that and say that Lewis is still teaching me about writing. Present perfect tense here. It's happening today. Number 1. Lewis put it this way: read all the good books you can and avoid nearly all magazines. Read all the good books you can and avoid nearly all magazines. What do you think Lewis is getting at with that advice? He unpacks that some more later. But just let me say a couple things here about this. In other words, we have to write out of a well-nourished imagination. You can't write well if you have an empty mind, and if you don't have lots of deposits in the bank of your imagination and of your knowledge base. It's not possible just to get a really good idea. I edit for young people. In fact, I have, just before this started, I got it in my inbox. I had a 16-year-old who contacted me, or mom contacted me a couple of weeks ago, who's got a 90,000 word manuscript that she's ready for me to copy, content, and developmental edit for her. And that's wonderful. And I love doing that. And I have time occasionally to do that for other writers. I can tell sometimes, I haven't seen this manuscript yet, but I can tell sometimes that somebody's got a great idea and they've got their teeth in it and they've been working dozens, hundreds of hours on it. But there's things missing that they needed to read, experiences they needed to have before they could write as an expert about this thing. You can get those experiences, young writer, vicariously. in books. And that gets back to Lewis's main point. Read all the good books you can and avoid nearly all magazines. What's he getting at? Well, magazines are transient, right? Newspapers are transient. The newspaper, you buy it on the streets of London in the morning, and by evening, it's on the floor of the canary cage, right? Getting horrible stuff dropped on it. It's a moving target. It's not there. It doesn't have the longevity that a book has. We'll talk more about some of the types of books that Lewis urges us to read. But Francis Bacon, one of the things I want to do is I'm going to talk about Lewis, and he's our main deal, but I want to give you some collaborative expert evidence too, not from me, but from others that like Francis Bacon. What does he say? He says, reading maketh a full man, and writing an exact man. Reading maketh a full man, and writing an exact man. It is not possible, let me just say this out there to get this out there in the open and out of the way early on. If you don't read, if you're not a reader, if you're not like I am, where I have thousands and thousands of books. I mean, I still, I stopped the other day at a garage sale, and what did I do? I came back with 3 more books. I read my books, and I reread my books, the best of my books. Reading maketh a full man, writing maketh an exact man. And Bacon goes on and says, some books are to be tasted, others are to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. Some few books to be chewed and digested. And I would commend to you, as Lewis is doing, read this kind of books. That doesn't mean you're not going to have some light modern favorites. I'm a Daniel Silva fan, guilty. Okay, not of all of the books, but many of them. And I read them not to get theological knowledge and not to get biblical knowledge, although he is very well informed biblically. But I read them really as a diversion, as enjoyment. They allow my mind and my imagination to work in a different direction. When I am researching and heavy duty stuff on Anne of Bohemia right now, 14th century contemporary of John Wycliffe, and a marvelous story of a godly teenage girl who was just saturated in the Bible, a vernacular Bible before Wycliffe even translates his Middle English Bible. As I'm doing the research and all that, I'm reading in a different way. I'm gathering facts and data, things that happen on the timeline of history, and looking at corresponding things that were going on elsewhere in the various fields, science, technology, music, and art and visual art and all those things. I'm reading in a very different way, and it's really helpful for me to pause and read something that I can read for enjoyment, and I can read rapidly. And guess what? That actually is also filling in lots of historical data about Hamas and Hezbollah and Judaism and Old Testament biblical things and all too. And it's all there. So my point is, spend most of your time reading that kind of book that needs to be chewed and digested. It's rich, it's meaty. Flannery O'Connor put it this way. She said, it is a good rule, after reading a new book, never allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. It's a pretty good rule, right? And it's a way to tell what's coming in. And she commends the books from the Western canon. It's been getting a lot of bad press for a number of decades now. Multiculturalism in the 1990s particularly was torpedoing the Western canon. And she says, she argues for reading the Western canon, she says, and if the student finds that this is not to his taste, reading old books in the Western canon, well, that is regrettable, says Flannery O'Connor. Most regrettable. His taste should not be consulted, however. It is being formed, she concludes. It's, you don't just read the stuff, well, I really like this writer. That's good. Okay. We need to find out why you like that writer, and we're going to talk about that in a moment in another point. But it's very, very important for you to read the books that you need to have read along the way, to be that exact writer, to be that full writer. Reading maketh a full man, and writing an exact man. Only if you're reading the important books and the right books, as well as the others that I've commended to you. Lewis put it this way. He said, keep the clean sea breezes of the centuries blowing through our minds. And he believed that that could only be done, as he put it in his words, that can be done only by reading old books. Oh, I love the smell of them. I love the feel of them. I just love it. And I would commend to you too on this point one still, read poetry, read the best poetry. And you might say, well, I don't like poetry. I don't write poetry. I'm writing prose. I'm writing fiction prose. Well, thanks for sharing. But if you're not reading great poetry, you're missing out on some very, very important components of being a full writer and being an exact writer. And we'll say more about this in a moment here, but one great writer has put it this way, that poetry is the push-ups of prose. Poetry is the push-ups of prose. And really it's not just emotive gushing, free verse emotive gushing poetry. The emotional striptease of modern, free verse writers. It's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about poetry that acknowledges the boundaries, the conventions. What is it that Robert Frost said, that writing poetry that doesn't rhyme is like playing tennis with the net down. It is important. There's a reason why there is the play on words, the parallelisms of sound, the parallelisms of idea, the metaphor, the pictures, the ideas expressed in pictures, created not with a paintbrush but with words. Poetry is very, very important for all of those reasons. Churchill understood that. He delivered so many of his speeches during World War II that galvanized the country to resist the Hun in iambic pentameter. He wrote them in iambic pentameter. Poetry is very important. Very important. It's the rhythm of your body. So much of it is. Take your pulse. What do you hear? Unstressed, stressed. Unaccented, accented. You hear iambic pentameter is what you hear. Your body is poetry. Your body is physiologically poetry, and God made you that way. He made your body to function that way, and your writing will function much more beautifully and much more persuasively, much more compellingly. Readers won't be able to put it down, right? They got to read the next book. Well, I want to go back and reread that book again. Great. Everybody on this summit knows, as the writers on this summit know, the importance of creating readership, and hopefully for good and God glorifying ultimate goals. If otherwise, it's wood, hay, stubble. Doesn't matter. It should go away. But poetry is the push-ups of prose. Read the best books. This is point one. You need a well-nourished mind. Read the old books, and read them with intentionality. Imitate their syntax. We'll get to more of that in a moment. Number two. Are we ready? Number two. See, I don't need screens. Number one, you got it. You've written it down. Number two, this is Lewis. Turn off the radio. Turn off the radio. Let's unpack that. What does he mean by that? Well, remember, Lewis dies in 1963. Television had been around for about 3 or 4 years by that time, and it was only in the most elite living rooms. It was very, very expensive. TVs were originally. Lewis didn't have one, but he had a radio. Of course, he was the voice of faith, the BBC voice of faith during World War II. I explore that in my book, The Resistance. It's one of the giveaway books on this conference. And Lewis's voice comes back over and over again throughout that yarn unfolding. Lewis, what is he getting at? Well, the radio, if the newspaper and most magazines are transient, they're ending up at the bottom of the birdcage very quickly. The radio is even more transient. The words are being said, whoosh, and they're gone, right? The radio was the primary way that you got your news. It was the primary way that you had any kind of public conveyance of story and so forth to a listener. Lewis didn't want to hear it on the radio, didn't want to read it in the newspaper. He figured that if something really important was going on, his friends would tell him about that. And he trusted his friends more than he trusted the BBC or the Times. And so he thought that he needed to get away from these distractions. The radio is going to primarily be a distraction. Imagine what he would say today. I mean, think about the distractions we've got with this thing in my pocket, right? If the radio was a distraction in Lewis's day, our 360-degree surround with social media and the constant warbling in your pocket of your phone and our constant checking of the phone and what's going on with that post and all. That is all the more a distraction. Some of my best writing time happens when I take my phone and I put it in a basket way across my scriptorium from where I'm writing, and I maybe just turn it off, but I don't even hear the warbles and all that are happening to that. I just ignore that, and I'm completely focused. I'm completely in the 14th century somewhere with my protagonist. Now, Lewis goes on about distractions, and he says this, and this is very important. I want you to listen really carefully to this. This is Lewis, don't use a typewriter. There were no computers, there were no word processors, there was none of the stuff you have. There was no Word documents or any of those things back in Lewis's day, were there? Don't use a typewriter. That was the technology of the day, right? And he says, why? The noise will destroy your sense of rhythm. And you're thinking, well, I want to be a writer. I don't want to be a musician. No, don't think that way. All the arts are intertwined. And he's saying that rhythm, something about rhythm is very, very important. And he goes on, your sense of rhythm still needs years of training, Lewis says. This is advice in a letter to an aspiring young writer like yourself listening into this summit. Lewis wrote all of his manuscripts with a dip pen, a dip pen. Not with one of these babies right here, not with one of those, but a dip pen. You know what a dip pen is? There's a vial of ink on his desk, and he's got a nib on his dip pen, and he's going to dip his pen. Does this sound like primitive? I mean, is this like with a hammer and chisel, right? A dip pen, all of Narnia, Until We Have Faces, for tip letters, all of that was written with a dip pen first. And then he would get the finished manuscript and he'd give it to Warnie, his older brother, who then Warnie would type it for him with the typewriter. But Lewis didn't want the distraction of the mechanical clatter of those keys going, like this, maybe, he didn't want that. That was a distraction to his imagination, but the dip pen wasn't. It was a benefit to him. He could write, Lewis said, about 4 or 5 words, depending on how long the words were, 4 or 5 words with his dip pen. So Lewis would dip the pen in the ink, and then he would write the 4 words, and he would actually, as he dipped, he would whisper aloud the next 4 words or 5 words he was going to write. And then he would write them, and then he would pause and dip, and he would verbalize the next 4 or 5 words he was going to write, and then he would write them with the dip pen, and then he would dip. Do you see what's happening here? And of course, the clatter of the typewriter would entirely disrupt. This is why I can't write in a coffee shop. Some writers do, and I bless them. That's fine. I can't write in I do. I've done it, but it's not my chosen place to write because there's a lot of, the hiss of the steam milk and all of those things happening in conversation here and conversation there, and somebody spills their coffee there, and all those things become distractions to the rhythm of my writing. Lewis then, over 12,000 letters that we have of Lewis. It's wonderful reading, and it's one of the places I go to do my research on most of my characters I read. If it's Martin Luther, the letters are so rich to find those things. If it's John Calvin and I'm writing about John Calvin, the letters, I learned so much. John Knox, the letters he wrote. You get the more personal person there along the way. But Lewis put it this way to one of his young enthusiasts, asking him, telling him how much he enjoyed the book they read, that she read, and then asking questions about writing, which is where we get these 7 things I'm giving you. He says one time, he says, "This will have to be an inadequate scrawl." He wrote this with a dip pen. "For my brother, who drives the typewriter, is away." Don't you love that? The image that is conjured up just with using the verb drives the typewriter, right? Lewis didn't drive a car either, or a motorcycle. Warney did all that for him. Lewis was busy with other endeavors. And so he left the driving of the typewriter up to Warney. I just love the way he puts that. He also said, "I don't have time to write you apologize. I don't have time to write you a short letter." You see the implication of that? It takes more time to be concise. We'll get to that in a moment here, but think about that. By the way, he was borrowing that from Blaise Pascal, one of my favorite reads. Blaise Pascal actually died August 19th. Check the calendar. Today is August 19th in 1662. And John Bunyan was in his 3rd year of imprisonment in 1662. 2nd or 3rd year of imprisonment of 12 years in those years. It was Blaise Pascal who originally wrote that. Lewis loved Blaise Pascal, and he borrows it when he says, "I don't have time to write you a short letter." The greats, those are the shoulders you and I need to stand on if we're going to write well, understood the importance of being concise, and that being concise takes time. Back to poetry. It's one of the reasons why the sonnet form, 14 lines, an iambic pentameter, 10 syllables per line, arranged in iambs, unaccented, accented. Whoops, that's your rhythm of your heart, right? Submitting yourself to that form and structure and the rhythm of that form and structure is so critical to being a good writer, prose writer. You want to be a prose writer. You want to write fiction, okay? You want to write fantasy. Wonderful, great. You want to write historical fiction, my primary genre. Great, wonderful. Read poetry. Understand poetry. Imitate poets. Write in conventional rhyme and meter. This is what Lewis is getting at here. And he goes on and he says, "Always write and read with the ear, not the eye. You should hear every sentence you write as if it were being read aloud or spoken. If it does not sound nice, try again," says Lewis. It's the test. Reading aloud, I read virtually all of my manuscripts aloud to almost or some of my own children or grandchildren before they ended up in book form, published and out there as a real book. I can always tell that in my Oxford Creative Writing Masterclass, one of the things that we do there in Oxford, right on location, at the Divinity School, the Bodleian Library, where Lewis spent so much time, or at the medieval Merton Library, the longest continuous in use library in the world, where Tolkien would have spent dozens, hundreds of hours, and we're in there, and I want to hear the actual reading of my writers that have joined me on the Oxford Creative Writing Masterclass. And it's so fascinating to me that as they read aloud, so often people catch their own things that aren't working. Maybe they don't know for sure why it's not working, but the reading aloud is the test of why it works or doesn't work. Oh, I need to work on that sentence. Yeah, you do. And maybe we have some then advice and counsel. How? What's going on? Maybe you're giving away the most weighty words or phrase early in the sentence or early in the paragraph or early in the chapter and not saving it for the end of the chapter. This is rhythm and the importance of rhythm. Again, John Philip Sousa, right? You know, if you've ever been in a marching band, I used to be in the clarinet, the marching band. I hated the clarinet. Don't get me started on that. But, you know, I'm in the marching band. And, you know, we're playing John Philip Sousa. And what does he say? He says that weight, as in W-A-I-T, makes weight. Do you get it? Weight makes weight. W-E-I-G-H-T, right? And that's why it's so important that you get to how, what's a John Philip Sousa march sound like? Da, 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 da. What's he doing in there? Weight makes weight. And it does. Are you developing your ear as a writer so that you can hear the weight? Your reader will not only see the weight in the words you're choosing to write about, but they'll feel the weight as you write. So critical, so important to do this. Aristotle, long before in his Art of Rhetoric, put it this way: what is written must be easy to read and easy to speak, which is the same. What is written must be easy to read and easy to speak, which is the same. You must read out loud. Your own writing, and I read the Psalms out loud every day. Did you know that? I pray the Psalms out loud. And on so many levels, that's such a rich spiritual experience every day, to pray back to God the very words of the saints who've gone before, who've been in anguish, they've been in suffering, they've been in trouble, they feel encircled by enemies, you know. And by the way, just as an aside, if you write things, you will have enemies. Some people will just hate your guts, you know, because they didn't like that or whatever. I remember getting hate mail when Rebels Keep, if you know the Crown and Covenant trilogy, when that first came out. And I'm writing about a time called the Killing Time in 17th century Scottish Covenant history. I don't write to aggrandize, this is a topic for another time, but I don't write to aggrandize violence, but violence is real, as it is in the Bible, and it's recorded in the Bible. But it doesn't, it's not there to be gratuitous and to give a thrill to the reader. All right, I want to get back to my Lewis thoughts here. So number 3, shall we do number 3? Let's sum up number 2. Number 2, you've got to get rid of distractions, and you've got to write more with the ear than with the eye. So critical. Number 3.
Douglas, I just want to jump in and just say, this is incredible. I mean, just gold nugget after gold nugget. I'm enjoying it. The students are just saying, "Oh, I missed that quote," and like trying to help each other get the quotes written down. They're writing notes.
Slow down.
We have a student with a dip pen who writes with a dip pen in the audience. So anyway, I just wanted to give you that encouragement. You're doing great. So keep it up.
Oh, dip pens. I love it. Okay, fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. I'd like to meet that person. All right, so we're going fast here. Number 3. What to write about? Do you ever wonder what to write about? Now, oftentimes you're writing because you already know what you already feel. You're writing because ink is the great cure of all human ills, and you've experienced something and you have to write about it, right? But oftentimes we're not sure what to write about. Lewis knew that problem, and he was asked that question in letters, right? What do you write about? How do I know what to write about? You know, and he put it this way. You ready? Write about what really interests you. It's not overly profound, is it? Whether it is real things or imaginary things, and don't write about anything else. Write what really interests you. Now, he goes on and he says, notice this means that if you are interested only in writing, Lewis says, you will never be a writer, because you will have nothing to write about. Do you see his point? If the passion is, I want to be a writer, you know, I want to, when I grow up, I want to be a writer. And I applaud young writers, and I wish that I'd had that. My first book was published when I was 40. You're saying, oh, heck, just a couple of years ago. No, like more than a couple decades ago. I didn't have what you have, and I envy that so much, and I bless you for it. It's marvelous. You have the inspiration already. You have the desire already. You want to write. You want to communicate with your pen, dip pen for one of you. That's marvelous. That's marvelous. But you have to have something that fascinates you, that intrigues you. Lewis had a boyish enthusiasm about life and about beauty, and that he exudes that in his writing because he was interested in so many things, and that's a good thing. He goes on and he says, well, let me preface this a little bit more. There is this romanticized idea about being a writer, and I hear it sometimes when people just think, "Oh, it'd be so more. How did you do it? You know, you got 35 books out there, and you lead these tours, and you do this Oxford Creative Writing Masterclass 2 or 3 times a year, and all of that, and that must be just this marvelous thing." I'm going to just tell you something. It's not nearly as glamorous or romantic as it sounds like. Save your romance for elsewhere. I'm a incurable romantic. It's your calling. It's what you do. You want to do it well. You want to do it ultimately to the glory of God. If you're writing because you want to aggrandize a writer, you can't wait to see that book with your name on it. That's a natural impulse too. Lewis has a whole passage about this for another time, where he talks about seeing his book, Spirits in Bondage, when it first appeared, published by Heinemann, and it was there at Blackwell's in Oxford, and he went in there and he picked up his book with his name on it. Actually, wasn't his name, because he used a nom de plume, because he was afraid it wouldn't be a success. It wasn't. It was actually a good strategy not to use his own name. Material for another time. Lewis puts it like this, and this should be helpful to you here, what to write about. He puts it this way: I am sure that some are born to write as trees are born to bear leaves. For these, writing is a necessary mode of their own development. If the impulse to write survives the hope of success, then one is among these. In other words, actually the dashed hopes of success is, I think, what he's getting at here. If not, then the impulse was at best only pardonable vanity, and it will certainly disappear when the hope is withdrawn. Now, I know people that used to come to my ink blots writing group that we would gather twice a month. Just have marvelous times. I'd recommend that to you. So get that started. Well, what am I saying? That's what the Young Writers Workshop is, right? That is just marvelous. Take advantage of that. Sign up. Push that, click that button. It's a bargain at 10 times the cost. That is so critical, that you are surrounded by this network of other writers, and that you gather, and that you encourage one another, and you read to one another, and you critique one another, and all. I know people that were in that group. They'd written this manuscript, that manuscript, all that stuff, and they sent it out to publishers, and they could wallpaper their living room with rejection notices, and they never got published. And I know some of them no longer write, and they say it was a waste of time. And I think that's what Lewis is getting at here. Oh, there's an inherent benefit in writing for all of us. For all of us. I have some manuscripts that are still sitting in my folder on my desktop. And who knows if they'll ever see print. And maybe they shouldn't see print. Maybe they don't, maybe I'll pull them out and I need to revise and all. But also maybe they never need to see the light of day. That's good. The impulse was at best pardonable vanity, and it will certainly disappear when the hope is withdrawn. The hope of being a published writer, when that hope dies, some people stop writing. Okay, that's okay. That's okay. It's not the end of the world, but it is important to have something to write about, and not just be aspiring to be a writer. And just to finish off on number 3 here, write about what interests you, what fascinates you might be a good way of putting it. What you think about a lot, what you chew on, what you really are compelled to pick up your pen and work on. That's what you write about. And Lewis goes on and says, don't throw away what you have written. He says, when you give up a bit of work, don't, unless it is hopelessly bad, throw it away. Put it in a drawer. It may come in useful later. Much of my best work, says Lewis, or what I think my best, is the rewriting of things begun and abandoned years earlier. I wonder if he's thinking about Till We Have Faces, a lesser read C.S. Lewis book, and one that secularists have insisted is Lewis writing just for entertainment and not writing with any religious ideas going around in his mind. Either those people have never read Till We Have Faces, or those people absolutely know nothing about Lewis's Christianity and his understanding of truth to be able to assess that book that way. If you haven't read it, pick it up, read it. You'll get my point. That's true for me too. I have things that stewed in their juices. That's what I call it, stewing in its juices. I have things right now, they're stewing in their juices. Some of my New Reformation hymns, I've got one on the book of Hosea, kind of a heavy duty book to write a hymn on. But a couple of years ago, I reread the book of Hosea, and I began writing a hymn about that book. If you can't remember it, go back. It's really an earthy setup for a prophet, for Hosea, and it's stewing in its juices. And maybe that's where it will be for the rest of my life anyway, is stewing in its juices. All right, number 4. Now this one is a little different. So get your pen ready. You're going to need to write down jot down a lot of things, because in this I'm going to give a lot of specifics based on something that Lewis says and several things that he says, and also related people writing as well. So get ready. This is one of those really meaty sort of ones. It's Lewis, and he says, here's the Lewis quote: "Take great pains to be clear. Remember that though you start by knowing what you mean, the reader doesn't. And a single ill-chosen word may lead him to a total misunderstanding. In a story, it is terribly easy just to forget that you have not told the reader something that he needs to know. The whole picture is so clear in your own mind that you forget that it isn't the same in his." Do you see the point? Be clear. I actually have a whole nother talk that I do, and I love this one. Guys will maybe relate to this. Well, I call it C4, explosive writing. Be clear, be concise, be cohesive, and be comprehensive. That's for another time, but the be clear is right here because Lewis is saying this for us, and we want to hear what he's saying and what he's getting at. And here's some sub-points for that. Lewis, always try to use the language so as to make quite clear what you mean and make sure your sentence couldn't mean anything else. Now, that's written by a poet, Lewis the poet. He saw himself as a poet. Now, by the way, I think that everything Lewis wrote in poetry, I've read a lot of his poetry, he said better elsewhere in prose, to be honest with you. So you might think, oh, he's not a very good poet. Well, he's who he was as a poet. But the poetry was the push-ups of his prose. Back to my first point. Always try to use language to be quite clear. Poets use language in metaphoric ways, as pictures too, and with intentional ambiguity, but not ultimate ambiguity. They still really do have something they want to lead the reader to understand. It's like driving the typewriter, right? Lewis doesn't want you to get sidetracked and think, was the typewriter has wheels and a steering wheel? No. He wants to awaken your imagination with that metaphor. He's not being unclear when he says drives the typewriter. I just really love that metaphor. I can just see Warney over there who typed with 2 fingers. He was an abysmal typist, as bad as Lewis would have been, but he hammered away. Loyal big brother, 12,000 letters and all the manuscripts. And at the kilns where we go to the kilns and various other C.S. Lewis sites on my Oxford Creative Writing Masterclass. We actually get to see Warney's typewriter there, and I touch the keys. Great book on Warney. I can't get off on that right now, but that a friend of mine gave that is really insight into Lewis as well. But on we go. Be sure, Lewis says, you know the meaning or meanings, plural, of every word you use. Now, sometimes we use words, and we'll talk more about this in a few moments here, to aggrandize the author and say, whoa, look at my vocabulary. Don't do that, okay? Stop that right now. But use words with precision. What's that word actually mean? Don't exaggerate when you choose that word. Use the precise word that actually conveys the degree as well as the specific meaning, but also the degree of what you're saying. And then, but again, as a young writer, I think there is this impulse, well, I need to have a big vocabulary, so I need to use big words. If I'm a good writers use big words, right? I would amend. I would try to steer you away from thinking in that regard and in those categories. Um, Lewis puts it this way: the way for a person to develop a style is to know exactly what he wants to say and to be sure he is saying exactly that. We think that developing a style means the use of metaphor, use of big words, vast vocabulary, so forth like that. Okay, it's good to build your vocabulary, and I enjoy doing that. But I want to only use those bigger words when they're the precise word, and I can't really convey what I want to say without using that word. Use the exact word. And what you say then exactly. He goes on. The reader, we must remember, does not start by knowing what we mean. Uh, um, you know, it's like driving sheep. He says, I sometimes think that writing is like driving sheep down a road. If there is any gate open to the left or the right, the reader will most certainly go into it. Now, if you've ever been around sheep much, it's true. Cattle are like that too on our little farm. If the wrong gate's open, or if you didn't block that, that road that goes up to the mill pond, if you didn't block that road with the truck, those cows, and you wanted to go one place, those cows are going to go the other place every time. And Lewis is making that point. So will your reader. You've got to be precise. Always prefer the plain, Lewis goes on to say, direct word to the long, vague word. The plain, direct word. Don't implement promises, right? Keep them. The best writers use simple words. Take Isaac Watts as a poet. One of the great strengths of Isaac Watts' poetry, his hymns, is that he uses lots of single syllabic words. He's not interested in, this grandiose multisyllabic words. By the way, ask Bill Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes, what happens in your poetry when you use multisyllabic words? It hits the tickle button, on your reader. Well, you don't want to do that in him, do you? You want the plain word, not the vague word. Never, and he goes on, never use, I told you we're going to hit a lot of things in this particular point, be clear. Never use abstract nouns when concrete ones will do. If you mean more people died, don't say mortality rose, Don't just say more people died, The plain, the straightforward is the clear, and the clear is preferred to the vague in good writing. Be very careful about that. And ask yourself the hard question: what's my motive behind wanting to use implement promises or mortality rose? Maybe I'm trying to aggrandize the writer, steer my reader away from the substance of what I'm writing and point them to me, the writer. More of that a little bit later. Don't use words too big for the subject. Don't say infinitely. Now the British do this. What's the word they use all the time? Brilliant. British do that all the time in their just conversation. When they're they're talking about the sandwich that they got at the pub. It was a brilliant sandwich. Well, oftentimes we Americans do that in our own ways too. We exaggerate, and exaggeration for the writer is not your friend. Now we can use hyperbole in poetry sometimes effectively, but in general, I think Lewis's point here is don't use the aggrandized word. He says, don't say infinitely when you mean very. Now, very and really are dead words. They've been overused. They've lost their meaning. In your 100,000 word manuscript, if you use very more than twice, I'd go in there and edit it. I'd kill it. And probably the sentence is stronger. Just killing it. You don't even have to rewrite the rest of it. Just kill the very. Better yet, find the strongest concrete noun or the most active verb, specific and precise active verb, and you got it. All right. And then my summation of some of this for the moment here, and then we'll move on to number 5. Never aim at style. Aim at authenticity. And by the way, I'm borrowing that. Elizabeth Elliot was asked a lot by readers who loved her writing, as well as the content of her writing, and I'm one of those. And she, one young writer wrote her, and Elizabeth Elliot gave her 10 things that will make you a good writer. That's one of the things I try to unpack in another talk I use. Elizabeth Elliot's 10 things. One of those is never aim at style, aim at authenticity. The reader should get so absorbed in your story that he forgets there is an author. That's your objective as an author should be to decrease, just like John the Baptist with Jesus. He must increase, I must decrease. The best writers are going to be saying all the times, how can I disappear in this writing? How can I go away? So that my reader is just so absorbed in this that they're talking about these characters as if these characters are real characters, Duncan and Lindsay, and on it goes. They've gotten so caught up in the story that they forget that there's somebody actually creating the story and the dialogue and the characterizations and all. That should be your goal. That is my goal. Otherwise, it's like when you lurch yourself, the intrusive narrator, when you lurch in there with the big word too grandiose for what you're trying to say, it's as if you're saying, forget the story, look at me, aren't I clever? Well, that's not a good writer doing that. If your story's good, if your characters are sound, if your plots is working and moving forward a pace, then you don't want to interrupt any of that with you, the writer. You must decrease. Jesus must increase. We'll talk more about the various ways that happens in the story in a moment here too. Don't use language to inflate the commonplace or the author. That would be the summation. Horace put it this way. Horace, back, Augustus Caesar, is wanting somebody to write the story of Rome. And so he first goes to Horace, one of the court poets, imperial poets, and he wants him to write the Aeneid. And Horace, who liked writing odes, which are short songs, says, I'm making up this conversation with the emperor. I'm sure you didn't speak this way to the emperor, but my strength is be brief, and that was Horace's axiom about writing. Be brief, and that will make you clear. And this is the point of number 4 on this: keep it simple and clear. If you can, one of the best ways to self-edit is go in and kill words that don't have work to do. They're not actually doing you any good. Kill them. Just sometimes you don't even need to rewrite the sentence. Just kill the words that don't have work to do. They're slowing your pace. They're disrupting your reader, and they need to go bye-bye. Number 5. Are we ready for number 5? Be clear was the last point there. This you've heard many, many times, I'm sure, as a writer. You've heard this over and over again. If you've read Elements of Style, you've heard it there, and you've seen it illustrated there, but show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. Lewis puts it in his words this way. Don't use adjectives which merely tell us how you want us to feel about the things you are describing, says Lewis. I mean, instead of telling us that the thing is terrible, describe it so that we'll be terrified. Describe the thing, show the thing, the episode, the sequence of events, the words said, the deeds that are being done by your actors. Show it and make the reader terrified. Don't say it was delightful, or brilliant, as our friends, the British, often say. Don't say it was delightful. Make us say delightful when we read the description. The reader can respond that way, but don't do that for them. Saying that it was delightful is telling, not showing. You see, all those words, horrifying, wonderful, hideous, exquisite, are only like saying to your reader, please, will you do my job for me? Think about it that way, and it will help you to assess yourself. Am I telling and not showing? Now, having said that, there are moments when you should tell some things in your story, various facts that need to be known for the story and the plot to make sense and to move forward. Those should be done in a concise, telling. You have characters in your story that we don't need to know, all of their gut issues or all of their emotional problem, because they're minor characters. And you can, in a few strokes of your pen, you can help the reader see who this character is. But you can oftentimes show those things even more strongly with those minor characters. Prefer that before you go to telling. Please, will you do my work for me? A good writer doesn't want to say that to his reader, because that means I'm not a good writer. I don't want to do the hard work, the heavy lifting of showing instead of telling. Another way that we tell instead of show, and this is a pet peeve of mine here. You ready for this? Avoid adverbs. Show action with action verbs, and you won't need to use adverbs. In dialogue, use said Jane. I know some of you have had rudimentary writing training, and it's a very good writing program. I'm not criticizing it at all, but where you have a sheet that says 300 different words for said on it. I think it's 300. I would suggest to you, as you move into being a good writer, at that stage, yeah, you needed that, but maybe. But at this stage, the stage you're in, throw that sheet away. Throw that sheet away. Attributions in your writing are pure function. They're just function. Is the person saying? Are they screaming? Occasionally they might be screaming. Probably shouldn't be, but they're screaming, right? So you can say screamed or yelled or shouted, because those are specific verbs that tell how someone is speaking. But prefer said. Don't say questioned, say asked, right? It's really, really critical to do this. Don't come up with creative ways to say said or asked. Just say said and asked. And don't say expostulated Jane, right? What you're doing is using a verb that maybe needs to be used elsewhere in a dialogue or something, but it doesn't need to be used in an attribution. It's a way of steering the reader away from the actual words Jane's saying that should be showing that Jane's pompous and she's expostulating. You expect everyone to be quiet and listen. Well, show that. Don't say she expostulated. It draws attention away from the story and from your character to the attribution, which is pure function. Watch a Shakespeare play. Henry V isn't up there saying, "If we are marked to die," said Henry. He's not doing that. He's just saying it, right? But in fiction, we need the attribution to know who's talking, right? It's pure function. Don't draw your reader's attention to the function. Just keep them there. Make sure they know. Attribute early in the paragraph so that the reader knows that's what it's for. I just edited a lengthy manuscript for a writer whose tendency was to put attributions at the end of paragraphs, at the end of what someone was saying. Well, that doesn't help us, We need to know who's talking next, So split that sentence, get that first phrase out there, comma, said Bill, comma, and then continue with what Bill's saying. It also can help you with the rhythm, by the way. If you're careful where you put those attributions, they can enhance the rhythm of what you're writing. That's an aside. Well, here's another aside, and I'll just put this for you this way, just as an example here. Telling would be, he was a couch potato. That would be telling. Does everybody understand that? By the way, if a sentence begins with a pronoun and was, you're probably telling, or a proper name and was, you're probably telling. It's a good way. Self-edit. Go back in there. Show that. He was a couch potato. That'd be telling. Show your reader what being a couch potato looks like in a boy or in a man. Posture, words, tone of voice, attitude. Show these, and if you have done a good job, you will not need to tell them that he was lazy, overweight, dull, sedentary. You don't have to tell them those things. How about this? "Would you give me another bowl of ice cream?" asked Larry, stifling a burp with the back of a hand that looked like an inflated surgical glove. He lay sprawled on the couch, his eyes half closed, his mouth more than half open. Light flickered from the TV where slender, energetic actors pitched the latest labor-saving device. Now, that took a few more words than saying he was a couch potato. But a couch potato is a cliche anyway, right? Avoid cliches like the plague, right? We've overused them. That synonym or metaphor no longer works because it's been overused. So avoid those like the plague. Okay, show, don't tell. I think I'm going to finish with that. Well, no, this is Lewis here, so I'm going to finish with this. This, which is eminently true of poetry, is true of all imaginative writing, said Lewis. One of the first things we have to say to a beginner who has brought us his manuscript is avoid all epithets which are merely emotional. It is no use telling us that something was mysterious or loathsome or awe-inspiring or voluptuous. Do you think your readers will believe you just because you say so? You must go quite a different way to work. Back to what Lewis said before, it's as if you're announcing to your reader, will you do my work for me? The hard work of showing Larry as this lazy, sedentary person who's a couch potato, but I'm not going to say that to you. I'm going to show that to you. All right, that's number 5. Ready? We move on to number 6. We're getting close. There's just 2 kinds of books, Lewis, or I'm paraphrasing him at the moment here. There's just really 2 kinds of books. Good ones and bad ones. 2 kinds of books. Now, there's all kinds of genre and subgenre, we know that, but there's good ones and there's bad ones. Listen to Lewis on this and think about this. This is a little bit longer reading from him, but I want you to follow this line of thinking and his reasoning, because I'm sure you've thought about this as a Christian and as a writer. So here Lewis on, there's really just 2 kinds of books, good ones and bad ones. Lewis, we must not, of course, write anything that will flatter lust, pride, or ambition, but we needn't all write patently moral or theological work. Indeed, work whose Christianity is latent, out there right in front of your face, like his Mere Christianity, for example, which, all by the way, also starts latent, I think, with the natural law and all that he explores there. But indeed, work whose Christianity is latent may do quite as much good and may reach some whom the more obvious religious work would scare away. The first business of a story, get this, the first business of a story is to be a good story, right? When our Lord made a wheel in the carpenter shop as a boy, depend upon it, it was first and foremost a good wheel or table or chair or whatever else he was building. Don't try to bring in specifically Christian bits. If God wants you to serve him in that way, he may not. There are different vocations. You will find it coming in of its own accord. Can't keep it out. It's so woven into the tapestry of what you're writing. If not, well, a good story which will give innocent pleasure is a good thing, just like cooking a good, nourishing meal, right? Any honest workmanship, whether making stories, says Lewis, shoes, or rabbit hutches, can be done to the glory of God and should be done intentionally to the glory of God. Now, I think there's an argument that could be made for there being more larger benefit. As I said, I read Daniel Silva. He's no Christian. He's a convert to Judaism, in fact. And I read C.S. Lewis, and I read so many other authors. And frankly, I gain more from reading Jane Austen, by the way, than I do from reading Daniel Silva. I just pulled out Persuasion. I'm going to reread it coming up here. Jane Austen's. There are works that are going to be of greater weight and import because there's intentionality behind. A Dostoevsky, for example, is far weightier and more valuable fiction for me to read in the big picture of my life and my view of the world and my place in the world and suffering and truth and all of those things than reading Daniel Silva. But you could craft Daniel Silva-esque espionage stories that are fascinating and fun reads and help me get my reading speed back up, before I launch into my next writing project. Sure you can. Well, any honest words? Having said that, and I'm going to end with 7 here in just a moment for your consideration. We're wrapping up, but Lewis tells us that all of his avocation writing, that would be Narnia, Screwtape Letters, Till We Have Faces, and a host of others, that all of that, Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, much lesser read book, love that book, great book, that all of his avocation writing, fiction writing, fantasy writing, whatever you want to call it, was another way of telling the Christian story. Now, sometimes he does it more subtly, as in Till We Have Faces, perhaps, arguably. But nevertheless, Lewis was burning. He was a man on fire. When he was converted to Christ, in 1931, converted reluctantly to theism philosophically in 1929, but when he was converted, he was a man on fire. He wanted everybody to know this marvelous Savior, Jesus Christ. And so his writing took on that character. Something to consider as you consider this about Lewis. You can write a fun, rip-snorting detective story. And Dorothy Sayers does that. Nine Tailors is my favorite of Dorothy Sayers. She doesn't really have a Christian agenda in there, and it disturbs me that sometimes she uses the Lord's name in vain. Some of her characters do. It does. That's another topic for another time we can discuss. But nevertheless, it's a rip-snorting, detective story. Better than anything Agatha Christie wrote, in my judgment, although I am a fan of it. All right. Something for your consideration. There's 2 kinds of books, good ones and bad ones. Number 7, and with this we'll wrap up. There's different objectives that you have, different motives behind why you want to write and why you choose to write the way you write. I discovered this not in a letter, so we'll wrap up with these other things came from letters exclusively. This comes from an essay that Lewis wrote on children, writing for children, children's books. It's a marvelous essay. I remember where I was when I discovered it, and I was so excited to read it. And I'm going to paraphrase 3 things, 3 sort of motivations behind our writing that Lewis describes, and then his critique of those 3 as we wrap up here. Lewis says, don't write what you think the reader wants. Number 2, don't write what you think the reader needs. And number 3, Lewis says, write what you need. Write what you need. Your entire posture as a writer, your voice as a writer, the way you form characters, the way you form your descriptions of action that's happening, all of that will be shaped differently if you're writing what you need. And guess what? You and I, as writers, as human beings, we're needy. The psalmist says we're poor and needy. End of Psalm 70. Right out of that poorness and that neediness. Blessed are the poor in spirit. You want to be a blessed writer? Right out of your own need. Right out of your own felt need. It's gonna be painful. It's gonna tell you right up front. Don't write what's popular and give them what they want, right? We can see through that like a ladder, right? You'll write eminently forgettable material. Fair enough. You might make some money, but you'll write eminently forgettable material. And don't write wagging your finger, lecturing your reader, giving them what they need, That posture isn't very effective. The best preachers of sermons, by the way, don't do that. And they're preaching. They're writing. They're preaching what they need. This is such an important point. That's why I've saved it for number 7 here. Well, if you write out of what you need, most of us are in some kind of trouble most of the time, sometimes in real serious trouble, sometimes of our own making. sometimes because of outside forces working against us, seeming to break us and trample on us and destroy us. C.S. Spurgeon put it this way: before God exalts a man, lifts him up, he first has to break him all to pieces. Before God exalts you as a writer, he's going to break you all to pieces. This is one of the reasons, this is one of the challenges for young writers. As young writers have, and I hope this is true of you, I want this for you, young writers haven't experienced a lot of life. And hopefully they haven't experienced a lot of the pain and trouble and affliction of life, right? And that's a good thing, but that's why you go back to number one, you got to be a reader. You got to get the vicarious experience of deep trouble and affliction, hard things that come upon you. You have to write out of your troubles and your fears and your own sufferings. Good writers write out of their own troubles. The Psalms, by the way, 40% of the Psalms in the scriptures, in our Bible, midway in the Bible, right? Are lament, anguish, suffering, bewilderment. Make haste, O God, to help me. Are you listening, God? The psalmist is in anguish. It's lament. It's T.S. Eliot back in the 1950s, who went to Harvard, and then he expatriates and becomes a Brit. But he was back in Harvard in the 50s, and he was lecturing on being a poet. And a young, enthusiastic 20-something-year-old woman came up after his lecture, and she was just all excited. She wanted to be a poet. Her goal in life was to be a poet. And do you know what T.S. Eliot said to her? It won't make you happy. It won't make you happy. You want to be a writer? You want to be a good writer. You want to write good books, not bad books, right? Books that people will read, that will be published over and over again. They'll be published in other languages. That's the kind of books you want to write. I know you do. But it won't make you happy doing that. I tell my Oxford Creative Writing Masterclass writers that in order to be a good writer, you're going to have to suffer. There's going to be bewildering things that are going to come crashing down on you in your life, out of which you're going to have something to write about, something really important to communicate, something real world. Because guess what this isn't? The world you're writing in and the world you're writing about, it's post-Eden. It's not the Garden of Eden before the fall. And it's pre-heaven. And it's sometimes bludgeoningly painful and troubling. I hope you get that vicariously. I'd rather have you get that vicariously, but you got to get that if you're going to write well. Finish off with just a few quickies. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who knew suffering in the Gulag. It is the artist who realizes that there is a supreme force above him, wrote Solzhenitsyn, and works gladly away as a small apprentice under God's heaven. That's the artist. That's the writer who's an artist. He recognizes he's a small apprentice. She embraces her smallness, her powerlessness. And then she's got something to say, something to write. Flannery O'Connor put it this way: you do not write the best you can for the sake of art, but for the sake of returning your talent increased to the invisible God to use or not use as he sees fit. It's a great way to write. God, I want to do this before your face, coram Deo, before the face of God. I want to write for an audience of one, King Jesus. And I don't give a rip whether I'm published and widely and in reprints and blah, 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 and tons of people. I want to write coram Deo before the face of God. Audience of one. Let's finish off with Lewis himself. Every poet and musician and artist, but for grace, he capitalizes grace, is drawn away from the love of the thing he tells, story he's writing, the characters, and so to the love of the telling. That's where you want to aggrandize the writer. You need grace to write well. Grace is not a thing, it's a person. That's why Lewis capitalized it. Grace is Jesus. Paul put it this way, great writer, the Apostle Paul, Colossians 3:23-24, and with this I close. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. You are serving the Lord Christ. Yeah, the young writer can change the world when he serves the Lord Christ with his pen. When she is working heartily for the Lord and not for the acclaim of men. And with that, I say, amen. 7 things. Let's keep those afloat as we're writing and write to the glory of God. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. There's so many comments and I want to send some of them to you afterwards, but one viewer says, this is the most beautiful and inspiring thing I've ever heard. And multiple said, I'm getting misty-eyed. Oh, my heart, I'm nearly crying. This is so beautiful, especially as you closed with that point 7. And yeah, thank you on behalf of everyone. I just want to communicate. There's so much gratitude in the comments of young writers just saying their hands are about to fall off from taking notes, but it was so good, so inspiring and encouraging, and just all of the wisdom that you have painstakingly gathered and delivered today. And it's so obvious that you have so much more, you could offer, and you're pulling from here and pulling from there, and that's another talk. But thank you for bringing this talk and choosing this one, and for ending with that encouragement. Yes, a young writer can change the world if they're writing for the glory of God by the grace that is Jesus Christ. Thank you for that. It's beautiful. So I want to close us off by letting people know you can get 2 of Douglas Bond's books. If you scroll down below his bio on this page and you click that button, you can enter to win The Resistance and War in the Wasteland, both by Douglas Bond. They are companion books. They go together. Please enter to win those books. We'll be sending them off to a few lucky winners. And please go and visit his website and learn more. You can go to bondbooks.net. You can learn more about his writing as well as his teaching, his teaching in Oxford, his tours in Europe, so many incredible things you can connect with Mr. Bond over. So thank you again. And we will be wrapping up here. We'll be back in a little bit, in about half an hour, for our next session, which is an Ask Me Anything with S.D. Smith, the author of the best-selling Green Ember series. I can't wait for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. So we'll see you guys soon. God bless you. And Douglas, again, thank you. God bless you for all of that.
Thanks for organizing. Yeah.